anybody who's taken part in the Atlas, and I'm sure many people here involved in one way or another will have their own memories of the Atlas. So this is my sort of a personal A to Z of the last few years. Hopefully some of this will sort of strike chords with you. Some of them you'll have your own different ideas. So as you know, I'm sure the Atlas alphabet actually starts with E. So I think E is for egrets, and of course we knew at the start of the Atlas that little egrets were going to be one of the stars, but quite how much I don't think we would have expected, nor that the other two egrets would actually be at the top of the range change table as well. So these three, when you rank all of the range changes for all the species, these three are at the top. So a real surprise, I think. Jay would have to be for Jay really, a species showing a moderate increase in Britain. This is the winter map. You can see, I don't have a pointer. You can see this area up in the sort of edge of the Highlands where they've increased quite markedly, but really a big increase in Ireland, 86% range expansion, and that's sort of mirrored in the breeding season as well. P is for postcodes. One of the sort of spin-offs, if you like, of using the web to collect all the data is we make everybody fill out forms with their name and address and postcode. And as you sure you know, we can link postcodes to grid references. And I think, I've not seen a map like this before showing the density of surveyors in a particular survey. So this is where everybody lives. And you can see some quite big gaps there. You can see the really marked difference between Britain and Ireland and just how much work the Irish had to do to cover the country with such a low density of surveyors. The two squares that are most populated by people, NT27 is Edinburgh, which is not what I'd have expected, and IO13, which is Dublin, not Belfast, as I said at the conference. Reassuringly, when you look at where surveyors actually went, all the white squares disappear, so somebody went everywhere. You can still see some of the main urban areas, London, northwest of England and so on, and you can see the big difference in coverage, sort of total coverage between Britain and Ireland. The same pattern, very similar pattern in winter as well for where people went. Two squares most surveyed, it's the same in both seasons. TF74, which is Titchwell, so it's a good bit of advertising for RSPB, and IO13 again is Dublin. So a lot more we can do with these data to look at how far people travelled from home. Already looking at some figures like what percentage of people travelled outside of their home 10k and that kind of thing. There's a lot of sort of social stuff we can do with this. U is for unidentified crossbill, making the point really that we have to be very careful about what we identify, what we can identify, taking note of recent research suggesting that a lot of Scottish crossbills can't or probably weren't, and that they're actually, you can only identify them on the basis of certain call types. So it's kind of a certain element of circularity to produce an atlas identifying species on the basis of where they are. So we have to be quite careful with these, and we'll be producing maps that actually combine a lot of the crossbill data and then producing Scottish crossbill maps using dedicated playback data from RSPB and Ron Summers. Z is for Zitting cisticola. Many years of predictions that this species would colonise, and you probably can't see it very easily, but it has finally on Alderney and Guernsey, where we had confirmed breeding during the Atlas. So finally one that gets on the list. D, I thought it should be for discovering new places. I'm sure anybody who's done Atlas fieldwork will have gone to places they didn't know about, found new places to go birding locally. Halfway through the Atlas I moved from Norwich to Cambridge, so that was a good opportunity really to sort of force me to get out and find new places. This is an area just north of Cambridge where I had large flocks of corn buntings and wintering peregrines and merlins. So it was really a great opportunity to get out there. For the Isle of Wight, I think you've heard me talk about this a little bit before, early on, trying to produce abundance maps and trying to work out whether species should or shouldn't be predicted to occur on the Isle of Wight. At the start of the atlas, this list would have included nuthatch because they, as far as we knew, they weren't there. But one bird was photographed at a feeder near Ryde, up in this part here, typically a square that spans the Solent, so it's both sides. You don't know if they are or aren't there. But nuthatches are now there in low densities. But these species, greylag doesn't breed there, tawny owl, surprisingly, given the amount of woodland there. These kind of fine-scale patterns of where species do and don't occur, there's a lot of research we can do, obviously, to understand these patterns. N for non-natives. We knew there would be some non-natives that would have increased a lot, but we certainly weren't expecting to have 96 species of non-natives recorded. Most of them are increasing, but of course it's very hard to say by just how much, because many of them just weren't recorded. They weren't, the attitudes towards recording non-natives have changed a lot. So, this increase from 0 occupied 10k squares in the first atlas for black swan now to over 100 is a mixture of expansion and better recording. But hopefully we'll be in a much better stage next time to do the next atlas. But we've certainly got a lot of information about increasing non-natives. T is for TTV, time tetrad visits, a phrase that's kind of become common to all atlases, I think. Staggering totals. We didn't expect to get anywhere near this number surveyed, and the actual number of individual tetrads surveyed, not far off 50,000 in total. This map shows individual, so each little pixel here is an actual tetrad surveyed. So you can walk from Land's End to Dundee on surveyed tetrads, which is quite amazing. 99%, over 99% of our target achieved. The shortfall is about 30 tetrads out of the 28,000 that we needed to cover, and most of those are kind of little slivers of land or little tiny islands just happen to be in the middle of a tetrad. So I think that's really, I would read that as 100% of our target achieved. And if you work that out, number of hours of each TTV, that's 33 person years, that's 24-hour days, 7 days a week. If you do it on a more moderate working day, it's not far off £6 million worth of effort, plus travel time, plus data entry time, plus all the roving records, which we can't kind of quantify the time for. It really does show the added value of the volunteer effort. Why for yellow wagtail, a species that for me grew up coming from the fens. This is very much a species that I grew up with, but you can see they are still there, but even in the fens they're declining, and these large areas of dark triangles where they're disappearing from, and we're seeing a third of their range disappear over the last 40 years. Maybe slowed a little bit, but still going on. Looking the other way around, see for Chives Warbler, a species that has increased hugely over the 40 years of our atlases. The first confirmed breeding was in 73, so just after the completion of the first atlas. There was actually one bird singing in Kent in 72, so it did just make it into the atlas, but for breeding just after. Now occurs in 421 squares in the breeding season. Surprisingly, quite a few fewer squares. You imagine they probably disperse a little bit. And I think this reiterates how we need to interpret all of the maps carefully for every species. They don't, as we know, they don't migrate away. So does that mean we've missed them in about 50 squares? So we've got to carefully look at each map and each species as we go through. H, I've said this is for Herando et al. Herando and Brotons are two of the lead authors of these two books, the Catalan Breeding and Wintering Atlases. And for me, these have been quite a big, I've forgotten the word, quite a big inspiration for what an atlas can look like, the kinds of things you can do with it. And the Catalans are very fortunate in some senses of having a relatively small area, but with a lot of altitudinal variation, so you can really see some really striking patterns. But we can see some of those as well with east-west and north-south patterns in Britain. But I think these are great books if you've not had a chance to see what they've done with them. They're really good. M is for margins, and I wanted to make the point that the atlas doesn't finish here. There's so much we want to do with the data once we've finished. We know that there are species that have in the past moved northwards. Have they continued to move northwards, and how much is this related to climate change or other drivers? So we know that hobbies moved about 100 kilometres north between the first and the second atlas. They have moved further north again, but perhaps less this time. Now, I'm told that the rate of warming within Britain slowed during that second period, so maybe that's a direct response. Is it that they ran out of habitat, or what are these balance of drivers for these changes? And looking at this across a whole range of all the species we've covered in the atlas will be really informative at looking at the main drivers of change. S, I wanted to put S for stock dove. This is a species that I think it's just a great species. I have them feeding in the garden at the moment, feeding on sunflower seeds that the goldfinches drop. This is one of the species that could have won the raffle winnings a couple of years ago, but unfortunately went to heron. But I think this is a great species, and it's showing some interesting patterns, like this huge decline. I didn't know until doing some of the literature reviewing for this species that they only really colonised Ireland in the 1800s, and they gradually spread northwestwards until the 1950s, when they sort of peaked there, and then since then they've shown this contraction back south again. And they're now, arable farming is basically concentrated down here in Ireland, so they've contracted back to the arable farming. So one of many species showing big changes in Ireland. X, I hope you don't mind me cheating slightly, but X is for extinction, and to make the point that this is the only species I think that has gone completely extinct during this latest atlas phase. So you can hopefully see these triangles here around the coast of Ireland. That's where corn buntings have actually completely disappeared from, and at the start of the atlas we had to make corn bunting a confidential species in Ireland just in case any were found. And I don't know what the risk would have been to them, but that was the worry, that they had completely gone, and none were found at all in Ireland. But you can see the same loads of losses in Britain. Losses, they are still on the Outer Hebrides, but I guess they can't be far off going the same way as in Ireland. A really worrying trend, and more than halved the population, the range size. B is for black guillemot, and this is really just an excuse to show one of the other types of abundance maps we'll be putting in the atlas. This is so for coastal breeding seabirds, some of the other coastal species like eider, rock pipit. We'll probably have maps like this which are showing the hotspots of density based on the abundance maps. So you can see quite clearly the high densities around Orkney and Shetland, and some of the Inner Hebrides. Interesting to look at these for species like eider as well. G is for great tit, and this is to remind me that there are interesting things going on even for common species. So something like great tit, which is present almost everywhere, you'd think there's not really anything to talk about, other than interesting that it's missing from the Western Isles and the Northern Isles. If you look at the change map, this sort of fairly random scatter of upward triangles shows where great tits have been sort of recorded in this atlas and not before. We can argue about whether that's colonisation or coverage, but still quite a limited pattern. But if we use the time tetrad data from the last atlas and now, we can see that almost across the board, great tits have increased in density almost everywhere. So there are still interesting things going on for boring common species. So there's a lot to look at and understand which of these species are showing these kind of patterns and where and why. L is for legacy, and I wanted to emphasise two types of legacy. As Graham was talking about a little earlier, fundraising, legacies and donations have been key to making the Atlas possible. But I hope that it doesn't stop there, and that we have other legacies in the forms of better collaborations, new surveyors who've taken part in the Atlas doing their first surveying and hopefully will carry on to do other surveys in the future. And the legacy of better coordination with local bird clubs and better partnerships, which I hope will sort of pay dividends in the future. R is for R. Many of you will know this as the package that we're using to produce all of the maps. I didn't know anything about R when I started the Atlas, so this was a good opportunity to learn R. And as I said at the conference, I hope I'm better for it, but it remains to be seen. W for woodcock, a species, as you know, we're running a breeding survey next year, and that's partly because it's a repeat of one 10 years ago, but also because we're seeing such contrasting patterns. A 37% expansion in winter, but more than halving of the range in the breeding season. So you can see that, I mean, this map is just dominated by downward pointing triangles. Most of them are open triangles, so that means they are a lot of older losses, a lot of more recent losses as well. Very few gains, just a few gains up in northern Scotland. So a species we've really got to understand better, and obviously TTVs don't really work that well for a nocturnal species like woodcock, hence the need for a dedicated survey. A is for abundance. Obviously the main driver of the TTVs is to collect information on abundance, so we can show maps like this, a modelled map here for nuthatch, showing the geographic variation in relative abundance across the country. We'll be producing these for as many species as we can in the book, both breeding and wintering, obviously. F is for flyovers, which have been a real headache for us to try and sort out, because all of the previous atlases have basically ignored any birds flying over and not said to be using the square. And this has been a real problem for species like pink-footed goose. And you know, we know that there's this huge movement of birds from the northwest across to East Anglia, and not always do they get given an F code to indicate they're flying over. So you get the potential to show range gains, which aren't real range gains, they're just new records of flyovers. So we spent a lot of time working with local validators and local bird clubs, and I think we've now got this pretty much clean of flyovers. So all these triangles in here, they really are pink-footed geese on the ground. They're odd flocks that just, I guess, in bad weather or whatever, get forced down to ground. And there's a surprising number of 1s and 2s of pink feet that just sort of hang out on gravel pits with grey lags and Canada geese in this area. But it's been quite a lot of work to clean up these records. K is for Kestrel, and hopefully you can see that map is largely dominated by browns, and this is to show declines in local density. So one of the species we're obviously very worried about, and RSPB are already working with us on trying to understand the causes of the decline in Kestrel. Q is for queries and validation. I'm sure many of you know that this is a massive job to deal with the 20 million records. We set out with an aim to check every single record, and I don't think we really imagined just how many records we would get and how big a task that would be. So we're indebted to the regional validators, just about 300 regional validators who've used their knowledge and a hell of a lot of time to use buttons like these to query, to sort of filter through all the records and to validate all the records. So here you can see that validators have checked 86%, individually checked 86% of the records. And on the back of that, another 14%, the sort of computer says yes on the basis of what the validator said. And just a tiny fraction at the end here, which are queried or unchecked. It's a huge job, and we really are indebted to the validators for doing that. And one of the reasons for starting the alphabet at E is that it finishes at V, so V has to be for volunteers. We know, as I said earlier, due to the online registration, we know exactly how many people took part in the Atlas online. Just over 17,000 people directly submitted Atlas records. But we obviously pulled in a lot of records from other sources. All the other BTO schemes, similar schemes in Birdwatch Ireland, and then data from specialist groups like seabird groups, raptor specialists, bird clubs. Across all of that sort of range of people, we reckon about 40,000 people could have taken part, and without whom obviously none of this would be possible. So we really want to, whenever you get a chance, whenever you're talking, whenever you get the chance to speak to a group of potential volunteers, to say thank you for this effort, and we really need to do that. And for most people, that's probably the end of the alphabet, but prior to 2007, there was a 26th letter of the alphabet, which was O. So O is for organisers. That we had about 130 regional organisers who went out their way to make the Atlas possible, booking out tetrads to people answering queries, as well as the 290 validators as well. And then there's obviously Dawn and Brian and Bob who organised in the different countries. And so they also deserve our thanks for making the Atlas possible. So that's it, and thanks for listening.